Hello, adventurers, and welcome back to the Dragon's Lair. Today we will be discussing the comic relief of Avatar: The Last Airbender, Sokka. Although, I would argue that he's more important than just the side comic character. But, you know. That being said, let's jump right into it, shall we? Moving into his first statistic, we're going to go with strength, as per usual. I would argue that Sokka's strength is relatively high. Some would argue that Sokka's strength is relatively low. Spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. Those that would argue Sokka's strength is relatively low would more than likely cite the instances of Sokka attempting to push something and failing miserably. And admittedly, Sokka does fail the usual tests of strength, like pushing, pulling objects, sometimes even striking with a bunch of force. That being said, there are other instances where Sokka's strength is astounding. For instance, in the final few episodes, Sokka holds Toph by one hand, keeping her from falling to her death, while fighting off two Sozin's comet-powered firebenders, with nothing but a boomerang and a sword, all while one of his legs was injured to the point to where he couldn't stand. I would argue that based on that alone, he's pretty strong. But I mean, you also have instances where he's able to fight off different types of people. Fighting with, be it the pirates, or other firebenders when trying to protect Aang, that sort of thing. So I'm going to put Sokka's strength, at a 20. Some might put it a little lower at maybe a 14. So that range, just for your idea. Moving into Sokka's dexterity, I would say that it's relatively high as well. Citing a similar instance, or the same instance, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1, where Sokka grabs Toph from while she's falling. While he's falling. You'd have to have a pretty high dexterity to do that. Not to mention the different fights that he gets in throughout the show, where he's able to dodge, strike, that sort of thing. For instance, Master Piandao. The final fight with him, he's all over the place. Dodging, evading, blocking with his sword, using the layout of the land to his advantage. So because of those reasons, I'd have to place Sokka's dexterity at 18 to 20 as well.
Airball.
Oh yeah. That would be an instance of bad dexterity. That being said, Aang had a very big advantage in that.
He knew how to play.
He's the only airbender, so there's not a whole lot Sokka could have done there, aside from try to use like a bat, like you would in baseball, but he didn't have one available to him.
Base airball.
Air baseball would probably be the better way to say that.
Nah.
Base airball. Okay, we're gonna move with it. Moving into Constitution. I've said it time and time again, Constitution doesn't really come up a whole lot in Avatar: The Last Airbender. That being said, it's really no different for Sokka. I mean, there are instances where it's arguable that his Constitution would be high. There are instances where it's arguable that his Constitution would be low. Sokka is the main fighter of the group. I mean, he doesn't have any bending, so he has to rely on his fighting ability. So I would argue for that, his Constitution would need to be relatively high. But, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. But, there are a few instances where Sokka is sick. So, there's that. There's also the bloodbending episode, where he kind of gets his blood taken over, so you could use that to argue that his Constitution is relatively low as well.
Still a little unfair.
Very unfair, but yes, it's what we've got to work with. So, for a range for Constitution for Sokka, I'd have to put it at anywhere between 8 to 14 to 16, just kind of depending on what your thought is. I would argue more 14 to 16. Some people, based on the examples given, would argue lower towards 8 and 10. It's your call. Moving into intelligence. Barring the fact that Sokka could be left alone with Aang in a room, making both of their intelligences very poor, removing that situation, Sokka's intelligence is relatively high. We know this because he's known as the self-given name, but he's known as the sarcasm and idea guy. And you have to have a relatively high intelligence to have the ideas and to be good at sarcasm. So, moving into examples, for instance, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. For instance, when Sokka comes up with the idea to weaken the tank drill from the inside, and to destroy it that way, when Sokka comes up with the idea to... There was one more, what was it?
Prison ship.
Yeah, the prison ship. Sokka comes up with the idea to help get Katara arrested using air vents. He uses the same principle to help get the Earthbenders something to bend when they're on the prison ship in that season. Or in that episode, rather. So, I mean, just to be able to come up with those ideas, you have to have a relatively high intelligence.
The Eclipse.
Yeah. Sokka was the one that came up with the idea to attack on the Eclipse as well. When the Firebenders would have their lowest ability, we'll say. They would be blocked out. They would be blocked away from the sun, so they wouldn't be as effective in their firebending. Unfortunately, that idea fell through, as the Firebenders knew that and were able to prepare for it. Moving into wisdom. Sokka has a relatively low wisdom. This is where Sokka fails. This is evident. Spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. This is evident when he asks Yue if she'd like to do an activity. Just the way that was worded, terrible. Sorry, bro. Not very good. The fact that he went out and drank cactus juice, that his first his first idea was to drink cactus juice. You have no idea what the plan is. You've seen it in the middle of the desert, and your first thought is to just drink it. It's like seeing a bear sleeping, your first thought being to go and poke it. Not a very good call. So because of that, I'm going to have to argue that Sokka's wisdom is probably at its highest 14, probably closer to a 10 or an 8. So moving into charisma, we're going to go... It's going to be... You've got to argue that Sokka's got a relatively high charisma. For instance, spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. We should be good. When he asks Yue if she'd like to go do an activity. Sure, that was worded terribly, but it works for him. I mean, she did want to go do an activity. Chill's dying off camera.
So good.
I mean, it worked.
So, he knows that a tomato is a fruit, but he'll put it in a fruit salad,
Unfortunately.
and he can give that fruit salad to someone else.
To use the tomato method, yes. He would be able to sell a tomato-based fruit salad. Which, for the record, is just salsa.
More crunchy salsa.
Yeah. But, like, salsa's tomato-based, and it's conglomeration of different ingredients like that, so...
True.
It could be argued that that is tomato-based fruit salad. Moving on to the more important things. Moving to Suki. First thing he did when he met Suki was insult her fighting ability, trying to prove himself. Thing with that is, it worked out in his favor too. Somehow. Moving on. when he tried to convince Master Piandao to train him, first thing he said was that Master Piandao said was that he had a bunch of different people, all great and skilled warriors that wanted to learn from him. The first thing Sokka said was that he wasn't worthy to learn from any master, much less someone as esteemed as Master Piandao. Well, that worked in his favor. The fact that Sokka was willing to admit that he wasn't skilled enough and wasn't worthy to be trained is what made the master want to teach him. So, with all of those instances, I'm going to have to argue that Sokka's charisma is pretty high, 18 to 20. Moving into the race and class. For Sokka, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to go human and fighter, specifically human variant. You get fewer ability score improvements, but you still get 2 by 1, increased by 1. You get a proficiency of your choice, and you gain a feat of your choice. Now, for the feat, there are a bunch of different Unearthed Arcana feats that work well with fighters, but they are Unearthed Arcana, which means you can't use them in Adventurers League, unfortunately. That being said, you have things like Great Weapon Master, Savage Attacker, things of that nature, and any of those work very well with fighters. Although Great Weapon Master, I'd be a little hesitant because Sokka doesn't necessarily use great weapons. Choosing short swords or hand-and-a-half swords instead of your general greatsword, and boomerangs as a secondary. Which boomerangs are dex-based. They're thrown weapons.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Moving into the class of fighter, I went straight fighter all the way through with defense and dueling as Sokka's the choice of Sokka's fighting martial. I believe they're called martial archetypes.
Archetypes, yeah.
And then you have the fighting archetype is what it is. But the fighting archetype, I chose champion. Although Battle Master makes sense as well. Champion just gives you more. Your critical is improved a couple of times. And at level 18, you're able to regenerate hit points for every round in combat, which is insanely useful. What are you looking for?
Just looking at, yeah, champion.
Yeah. Thanks. I said that.
Double checking.
It's so hostile about it. Moving into the conceptual build for race and class. Race, you've got a few options. It's Irani Wood Elf. Is just kind of better in general than the Wood Elf option because you get an extra 5 feet of movement. You still get the ability to hide behind natural objects, like nature-based things, like a light mist or a somewhat deeper than normal shadow. But you get an extra 5 feet of movement, which is really useful. Then you have options of half-elves, but it seems like a rip from the Wood Elf option, so I'm going to also say that you got the option of, for my build, this is a bit of a stretch, but to me it makes the most sense with what is going on with Sokka. Goliaths. Think about it. They're attuned to the cold, right? They're acclimated to the cold, I guess is the better way to say that. And they gain abilities to kind of just help them push and pull objects, right? So their size, they count as one larger when moving an object and determining their carrying weight.
Yeah.
So it works with Sokka's build of fighter, especially if you were to go in the more conceptual route and do something like Barbarian, which isn't my conceptual build, but it does make sense with Sokka. Any martial, like, fighting class makes sense as Sokka. It just would take a little bit of work. But for the conceptual build, I chose the Kinsey Monk until level 6, because that gave you the weapons that count as magical for the sake of getting around magical defense. And the unarmored. Actually, that would also give you unarmored defense as well, which is somewhat useful in the beginning. But from there, I went rogue, specifically a scout rogue, because you gain a little bit of extra movement, and you have the abilities such as sneak attack and things of that nature, which Sokka is always willing to do a good sneak attack, although he shouts it out before he does it, which kind of defeats the purpose of a sneak attack.
A little bit.
But, I mean, it's the thought that counts. So, Scout Rogue just kind of makes the most sense for Sokka, especially when you mix that with Kinsey Monk for the first 6 levels, Kinsey Monk, and then after that, Scout Rogue for 14 levels. Moving into the backstory. His backstory is very similar to Katara's. Spoiler alert, 3, 2, 1. We should be good. They lost their mother at a young age to the Fire Nation raids, and then subsequently lost their father to go fight the war. So, when their father left, Sokka was made the man of the village, which essentially meant he was the overseer and was supposed to make sure that it was safe from attacks. Which is a role that he took very seriously. So when the Avatar showed up, at first he was skeptical, but eventually he was more than willing to go with the Avatar to end the war that had plagued them for about 100 years at that point. Moving into the items, Sokka has 2 items. The Boomerang of Returning and the Moonstone Sword. Starting with the Boomerang of Returning, this is an enchanted item, an enchanted boomerang specifically, that has the Water Tribe crest on it and a blue handle. And what it does is it's always called back to the hand that threw it, right? It may take minutes, could take a day, weeks, months even, but it always returns to the hand that threw it. Limitations on this item may require attunement, so there's that. Going into the Moonstone Sword, this sword was forged by a master swordsman out of meteorite elements.
Meteorite.
Yeah, thank you. And that gives it a black color. Now, this sword is a technically long sword, so it is versatile, right? This sword's damage is going to be 2d8 or 2d10 because it is versatile, and it is a bit of a better sword. It also has the property of being finesse if the wielder would like it to be. Limitations on this could include the lowering of the damage to normal damage, the requiring of attunement to the sword as is, or the removal of the potential finesse property. That being said, to give this sword some sort of value, it either needs more damage or the ability to be finesse at minimum. But that's your call as a DM to make. If you are running a highly magical campaign, you could consider adding necrotic damage or fire damage, possibly cold damage to it as well, because it is a meteorite sword. It came from space, and it's going to be colder in space.
Oh, a little bit.
A little bit. So those are ideas. But that is all I have for you today, my fine adventurers. So, is there an idea you have? Different items that I may have forgotten? A disagreement with me on ability scores or race and class? Ideas you have that could help other DMs out there looking to involve this in their campaign? Leave it in the comments. I would love to read it, and you could just help someone out. As always, my Discord, Twitch, and other social media are linked down in the description below, so check those out if you would like. Aside from that, be on the lookout for my next video. Off. Other than that, I will catch you all later.